بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد خاتم النبيين وإمام المرسلين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. The next two lines in this Bayquniya matan deal with types of hadith with regards to who they're attributed to, and which is المرفوع والموقوف والمقطوع. وما أضيف للنبي المرفوع وما لتابع هو المقطوع وما أضفته إلى الأصحاب من قول وفعل فهو موقوف زكٍ. So وما أضيف للنبي المرفوع, marfu' means, and that's the first type, it's a type of elevation, it's an elevated hadith, and the elevation is because it has been attributed directly to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And by this the author excludes al-mawquf, which is what has been attributed to the companion, and al-maqtu', which is what has been attributed to the tabi'i, the successor and after him. Now there are four examples, four types, I guess, if you will, of what marfu' means. And the four examples are الرفع القولي والرفع الفعلي والرفع الوصفي والرفع التقريري. So it's an elevation of statement, الرفع القولي, elevation of action, that's الرفع الفعلي, and elevation of description, that's الرفع الوصفي, and elevation of affirmation, which is الرفع التقريري. To give you an example, الرفع القولي, so an elevation of statement, is when you take the statement in the hadith and you say that the Prophet ﷺ said. So you'll see in the books of hadith where the companion will say قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم, you know, that the Messenger ﷺ said, or حدثنا, or he told us, أخبرنا, something like that. Anything that directly indicates that the companion heard this directly and it was a statement of the Prophet ﷺ that has been said. وَالرَّفْعُ الْفِعْلِ, so when an elevation of action is when you attribute an action that is narrated in the hadith to the Messenger ﷺ. For example, when Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anhu says that we were in a funeral gathering in the Baqi' in Medina, and the Messenger ﷺ came to us, and he sat, and we sat around him, and in his hand he had a small stick, and he was just kind of playing with it on the ground, digging with it into the ground. All these are actions of the Messenger ﷺ that are being related to us by the companion, and so that's something that's called the raf'ul fi'li. The next example is raf'ul wasfi, which is talking about a description of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So when you hear a hadith talking about the Prophet ﷺ was not impressively tall or unusually short, he was middle stature, things that speak about the description of the Messenger ﷺ, all that is attributing a description, and so that's also part of what al-marfu' is. The last example is al-raf' al-taqriri, which is an elevation of affirmation. And that's when you hear something that has been affirmed by the Prophet ﷺ, such as someone eating the lizard in his presence, and the Messenger ﷺ approving it. He's not negating, he's not saying that shouldn't happen. He just approves that action. So these are the four types of elevation. Now, there are two general categories of elevating a hadith. It can either be direct, in Arabic we call that sarih, explicit, and that's when it's all these examples that I have just listed for you. These are all explicit attributions to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Or the second category is hukmi, which is just by rule. And there are multiple types of that, and from that you can get something like when the companion would say that we were commanded, or we were forbidden, or it was made obligatory upon us, or it was made impermissible for us. All of these they're not explicitly saying that the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam commanded us to. That's not explicit. However, it's clear that the companion would not be attributing this to anyone else other than the Messenger ﷺ. So for a categorization purposes, this is categorized as rule to be elevated to the Messenger ﷺ. وَمَا لِتَابِعٍ هُوَ الْمَقْطُوعُ. So the next half of this line, he's describing what al-maqtu' is. The maqtu', or what we could translate as cut off, is something that has been attributed to a tabi'i, to a successor, and someone after him, from actions or statements, regardless whether the tabi'i was a major tabi'i or a minor tabi'i, whether the sanad, the chain of transmission, is connected or not. So, what is a tabi'i? A tabi'i, a successor, is a Muslim who met a companion and died upon Islam, regardless whether his meeting and hanging out with the companion was lengthy or not, whether it was for a day or for a year or 10 years. And then the tabi'is, the successors, are of two types: sigar wa kibar. If you take that literally, it just means young and old, but that's not what it's referring to. It's just sigar tabi'in, the minor tabi'is, the minor successors, are ones who narrate most of their hadiths from other tabi'is, from other successors, and only few of the hadiths that they relate are from companions. Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Ansari is an example. Abi Hazim Salam ibn Dinar is another example. Kibar al-Tabi'in, the major successors, are ones whose most of their hadiths, or many of their hadiths that they relate, are directly from the companions. And very few of their hadiths are related from other tabi'is, from other successors. Examples of that is Sa'id ibn Musayyib, Qais ibn Abi Hazim, Ubaidillah ibn Adi ibn Khiyar, people like that. They're very well-known tabi'is, major scholars of Medina. Now, the maqtu' could actually be elevated to mawquf, and the waqf could, and the waqf, which is going to come in the next line, is about attributing it to a companion. But we'll get into that in a second here. An example of a maqtu'. Mujahid. Mujahid is one of the major figures that you see in tafsir texts. And just as a side note, when you read tafsir and you see something by Mujahid, especially things that relate to the history of the previous nations and a lot of history of where we came from and whatnot, there's a lot of Isra'iliyat that have been attributed to Mujahid, and so he's one to actually watch out for when it comes to tafsirs that relate to this. So it's things that basically should be taken with a grain of salt. But he's a pious tabi'i that's been used quite extensively in tafsir. Now he says, لا ينال العلم مستحي ولا مستكبر. So he says that none will achieve knowledge, would receive knowledge, if they are too shy or too arrogant. If you're too shy, you won't ask. If you're too arrogant, you won't ask. Therefore, you won't get knowledge. That's a hadith that is maqtu'. It's not attributed directly to the Messenger ﷺ, it's to the tabi'i. Imam Malik, he's from tabi'i tabi'in, he's from the generation after the successors. Whenever he used to say goodbye to his companions, he'd say, اتقوا الله وانشروا هذا العلم وعلموه ولا تكتموه. Have awareness and awe and fear of Allah, and spread this knowledge and teach it, and do not withhold it. So that's a hadith that's a maqtu' as well, because it goes back to Imam Malik, or it goes back to Mujahid. What is the ruling for that? That should be your next question that comes to your mind. Is this something that we can use as evidence for issuing rulings? It's not. ليس بحجة, because it's not a proof, because it doesn't have a qarina, it doesn't have an evidence, some sign to make it elevated to the status of being a hadith directly from the Messenger ﷺ. These statements could be just statements of these tabi'in, these successors. We don't know. if we get an evidence that might elevate it to the status of mawquf, which is attribution to the companion, it will just get the ruling of mawquf, which we'll talk about in a second. From the types of hadiths that are maqtu', so they're just attributed to the successors, the ones that would receive the ruling of marfu', it could actually be like an evidence that would get it up to the status of being something that the Messenger ﷺ said. If the tabi'i, if the successor, talks about a reason for revelation, so he has a hadith that he relates, he says this verse was revealed because of this particular incident, or he has a statement that has nothing to do with opinion. It has something to do with religious practice, and the only way that you can get anything from religious practice is from the Messenger ﷺ. All that would receive the ruling, the judgment in hadith terminology of al-marfu' al-mursal. So it's elevated to the Messenger ﷺ, but it's mursal. When we say mursal, we're talking about something that is lacking the companion now. We don't have the companion that relates this, so there's a cut in the chain. Now, when the tabi'i says min as-sunnati kada, so it's from the sunnah. Let's say that Sa'id ibn Musayyib says it's from the sunnah that you should do such and such. Imam al-Nawawi, in his introduction to his commentary on Sahih Muslim, he says that this is mawqufun muttasil. It's actually not it's not a maqtu' now. He elevates it to a mawquf, so it's attributed to companion, and it's actually connected. And he relates that some of the Shafi'i scholars say that it's actually marfu'un mursal, so it just goes back to the opinion that it's been elevated to the Messenger ﷺ, but it's just cut. It's missing the companion in the midst of it. Imam al-Iraqi says it's mawquf. So all this is just basically getting into technical details of what do you classify this as. At the end of the day, we're talking about something that if the tabi'i says this is a sunnah, clearly he did not make it up. Now Imam al-Iraqi says this is mawquf because sometimes sunnah is not necessarily just from the Messenger ﷺ. Sunnah sometimes refers to the khulafa, the Abu Bakr, Umar ibn Khattab, Uthman and Ali radiallahu anhum. So sunnah is not necessarily just something about the Messenger ﷺ. At any rate, in all cases, the tabi'i would not make something up, and it's not his opinion anymore. So therefore, it would receive a ruling that would become as part of the evidence that we would apply. Now, if the tabi'i says, we were commanded, umirna bikada wa nahwihi, we were commanded to do such and such, is this mawquf? So is this something that would be elevated to being attributed to companion, or is it marfu'un mursal? Is it something that gets elevated to the status of coming from the Messenger ﷺ, but missing the companion in the chain of transmission? The tarjih of this one is that it's marfu'un mursal, that it elevates to the status of the Messenger ﷺ, but we're lacking the companion in the chain of transmission. And that's the opinion of Sheikh Zakaria al-Ansari that he relates from Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. And basically the idea with this is that whenever you're speaking about being commanded about something in the religion, the most likely attribution is that it came from the Messenger ﷺ, and we're just lacking the person of the companion in the chain of transmission. And so that's marfu' and that's maqtu'. These are kind of like your two sides. موقوف is in the next line. وما أضفته إلى الأصحاب من قول وفعل فهو موقوف زكين. Zukin means ulim, mean it's known. Mawquf, and the translation of this line would be whatever you attribute to the companions from statement or action, its ruling is mawquf. It stops at the attribution of the statement as mawquf means that it stops with the companions. And that relates to now statement, action, affirmation, whether the isnad, the chain of transmission, is connected to them or if it's cut off. Okay. Now, some of the fuqaha, And this is where you have a difference now between what the fuqaha will term something and what the muhaddithin will term it. Some of the fuqaha will call the mawquf something that is just attributed to the companions, athar, and they will say that the marfu' is a khabar. جاء في الأثر جاء في الخبر. It's been related in the athar, it's been related in the khabar. Imam al-Nawawi says عند المحدثين, all of this is called athar, whether it's marfu' or mawquf. Again, we're just talking semantics now and just categorizations. What is a sahabi? Sahabi is someone who met the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, believing in him, and dies upon Islam. And when we say he met him, we're including in it sitting with him, walking with him, each of them meeting at some point, even if they did not talk, and this includes both of them seeing each other. So it's a very general, the definition of what makes a companion is very general. Even someone who did not see him with his eye, someone like Ibn Maktoum, he was blind, but he was a companion. He was at one point even left behind to lead the prayer. But he's a companion. He didn't see the Messenger ﷺ with his eyes, but he's a companion still. Also, the belief that he has to be a believer, that would exclude anybody that was a disbeliever. Meeting the Messenger ﷺ as a disbeliever, that's not a companion. And an example of a mawquf is Umar radiallahu anhu saying, تَفَقَّهُ قَبْلَ أَن تُسَوَّدُوا. Learn your fiqh, learn your religion, understand your religion properly before you become rulers over others. And there are two types of mawquf based on the ruling. The first type is mawquf that has a judgment of being elevated to the status of marfu'. And the second one is a mawquf that has a status of not marfu'. It does not receive that status of being elevated to being a statement of the Prophet ﷺ. Now the first one, the one that gets elevated to the status of marfu', is when the companion says we were commanded, or we were prohibited, or it's become obligatory upon us, or it's become permissible for us, and anything like that, where it's the name of the person doing the command or the prohibition is not named. All that is marfu', because in all cases, if the companion is telling you that they were commanded or prohibited from something, it's the Prophet ﷺ doing it. Okay? And so this is just a general rule when you see something like that from the messenger, from the companions. The second type is when the companion says, we used to do, or we used to say, or they used to say, or they used to do, and we, or something like, oh, we didn't see a problem with this, or they didn't see a problem with that in the life of the Messenger ﷺ while he was amongst us or between us. All of that is an example of something that would be elevated to marfu', because if the companion is telling you that they used to do something while the Messenger ﷺ is around and he wouldn't stop them from doing it, that's one of the rulings of him doing what? Taqrir. He's affirming, he's approving this action or the statement. The third type is the companion saying, min as-sunnati kada. You know, it's from the sunnah that you do such and such. Or if you do something, they would say, asabta sunnah. You have actually achieved the sunnah here. Or when they tell you the sunnah and such a thing is to do such and such. So whenever they bring up sunnah, that it's a sunnah to do this action or to do that action, all that is attributing something to the Messenger ﷺ, because we're not talking about when the companions are doing this, they're attributing something to the Messenger ﷺ, that while he was around, this was his sunnah, this is what he did. And that's the third type. The fourth type is where the companion says something from matters that have to be transmitted, or he does an action that has no ijtihad in it. He has no choice in coming up with his own opinion about it. Or he issues a ruling that relates to obedience of Allah and His Messenger. Whenever it comes to this, you automatically have to assume that the companion is not the companion is saying something that he got from the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Give you an example. Amr ibn Abasa radiyallahu anhu, he says that on the day of judgment, dunya will be brought up. All your actions in dunya will be brought up. All the people from dunya will be brought up, and they will be distinguished and discerned. Whatever was for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and whatever was for other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it will be thrown into the hellfire. That's a statement of Amr ibn Abasa. Now, he doesn't say that the Prophet ﷺ told me, but he's now telling you something from what? Umur al-ghaybiyat, things that are from the unseen, and something like that would have to be transmitted from the Messenger ﷺ. So we'd say hukman, now we elevated it to a statement of the Messenger ﷺ. The fifth, when the companions speak about the reasons, the causes for revelation. So when Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, he says that the people of Yemen used to do the pilgrimage and they would not take sustenance with them. كان أهل اليمن يحجون ولا يتزودون. And they used to say ويقولون نحن المتوكلون, we are the reliers upon God. فإذا قدموا مكة سألوا الناس. So when they arrived to Mecca, they started asking people, begging people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed with this, وَتَزَوَّدُوا فَإِنَّ خَيْرَ الزَّادِ التَّقْوَى. Take sustenance with you. The best of sustenance is awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But take sustenance with you. Don't go just empty-handed so that you start begging at the end of it. So whenever the companions tell us that this is the reason for revelation, or when they talk about tafsir, giving you meanings for verses of the Quran, and these meanings are not related to the Arabic language, and the meanings they tell you are not about their opinion or their ijtihad, things that deal with the unseen, know that this is no longer something coming from them. This is something that is coming from the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. An example of that is when Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, in the verse lawahatun lil bashar, he says that the skin, when Jahannam, when hell, when someone is thrown into hell on the Day of Judgment, the fire from hell will just hit them once, and it will not leave any meat on the bone. And that's what lawahatun al-bashar means. Now Abu Hurairah clearly would not bring that up from his own knowledge. He brought that up from the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now when it comes to the just a side point, when it comes to tafsir and the companion is talking about meanings and language and giving you an example of judgment that his opinion has a say in it, that does not achieve the status of marfu' anymore. It goes down to mawquf. It's the statement of the companion. The sixth and the last one here is the statement of a tabi'i, or other than a tabi'i, so like a tabi'i or a tabi'i. Whenever the companion is mentioned, then that actually elevates the hadith to mawquf from marfu', to marfu' from mawquf. So if the tabi'i is telling you something and then the companion is mentioned and then he tells you a hadith, that now elevates it to rafa'. And again, we're talking about things that have no room for personal opinion here. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. I think we'll just leave it at that for now. We'll finish off with the hukum of the mawquf. Al-mawquf, so if the statement has not been elevated to the status of being a statement or an action or an affirmation of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, it is no longer evidence it's not a hujjah. It's not evidence. You can't use it to issue a ruling anymore, because now you're what? You're attributing the statement to the companion and you're stopping at that. It's not a hadith that you can use now. If the rafa' and the waqf have a contradiction, so No, we'll leave that actually. We'll leave that. We won't make it complicated. So, again, the ruling for maqtu' is not a hujjah. The ruling for mawquf is not a hujjah. Just a general principle. If you hear a statement of the tabi'i, or a tabi'i, or a companion, and that statement has no room for it to be an opinion, the person is talking about a verse from the Quran and explaining a reason for why it was revealed, or giving you an explanation of what it means, and this explanation is not based on linguistic and opinion matters, then that elevates the hadith to rafa'. Okay, and the rafa' could be mursal, or it could be muttasil in certain cases, depending on if you're doing this from the companion or you're doing it from the tabi'i or tabi'i. The hujjah is only for marfu', so whenever you have a hadith that has been elevated, then you can use it as a proof of doing something in the religion. Otherwise, you cannot use it as evidence to make people do something. And we'll leave it at that, inshallah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.